Titanic is the most famous story of a ship sinking. And I've always wondered why. Why do we remember the Titanic over every single other ship that's ever sunk? Because there's been a lot. And that's a story that's always fascinated me. And so today that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the fact that there were rumours that it was unsinkable, which led to its sinking. And also, apparently, there were quite a few stories that happened years before that supposedly predicted the tragedy would happen. So the Titanic actually belonged to the White Star Line, which was founded in 1871 by Thomas Ismay. The owner of the White Star Line when Titanic was built was actually Bruce Ismay, the son of the man who founded the company. The ship itself was built in Belfast at a shipyard that belonged to Harland and Wolff, and the construction started on the 31st of March 1909, and about 2 years later, by the 31st of May 1911, the ship was ready, launched and inaugurated. The 10th of April 1912, the ship is docked at Southampton, ready for its maiden voyage to New York. That fatal first trip that led to the deaths of hundreds of people. Contrary to popular belief, no one at the White Star Line or Harland and Wolff ever claimed that the ship was unsinkable. There were some builders who worked for Harland and Wolff who built the Titanic that said that its system of watertight bulkheads made the ship virtually unsinkable. And of course, the word virtually was soon forgotten and people just went around thinking that the Titanic truly was unsinkable. So technically, you cannot condemn the White Star Line for saying it was unsinkable because they never did. However, you can condemn them for not denying it because they never did that either. It was great publicity, people were talking about it everywhere. The ship had already broken so many records. It was the biggest ship ever built by man. It was the heaviest ship afloat. It was the most luxurious ship that was ever designed, and it was also believed to be the safest. And so people were like, wait, in addition to all those amazing things about this ship, you're telling me this ship is unsinkable? You're telling me the Lord himself could not sink this ship? And so the White Star Line thought, well, there's no harm in not telling them that technically it isn't, right? It's not like anything's gonna happen. So the watertight bulkheads were built into the ship's hull, which is the bottom part of the ship, and there were 15 of them, which meant that they divided the ship in 16 watertight compartments. Now this was a safety measure, and technically it was a pretty genius safety measure because it meant that these watertight compartments, if hypothetically a collision were to happen and for some reason the ship's hull were to fill up with water, thanks to those bulkheads creating those watertight compartments, it meant that the ship could potentially stay afloat with 1 or 2 compartments underwater. So technically, that's a safety measure that's absolutely incredible and every ship should have, right? However, this was a deliberate choice by the design team and Thomas Andrews, the architect, and I cannot tell you what on earth went through their minds when they decided that, but they decided that the bulkheads would not go all the way to the top. I believe they stopped at about E deck, which meant only part of the ship's hull was protected and the bulkheads themselves were only about 10 feet above the waterline. It meant that there was a space where there was no bulkhead, where there was no watertight compartment that was fixed. It meant that if technically the ship were to collide and fill up with water, the water would fill up and reach the top of the bulkhead. And then that water would fill up into the second watertight compartment and get to the second bulkhead and fill up the third compartment. Which meant that the design of the bulkheads themselves were completely flawed in the Titanic, which rendered the watertight compartments completely fucking useless. Another mistake that was made was the lifeboats. Now, it's a well-known fact that there weren't enough lifeboats to save everyone. There were only 20 lifeboats on that ship for more than 2,200 passengers. It is believed that had the lifeboats been fully loaded to their full capacity, they would have saved about 1,178 people, which, compared to the number of people they really had on board, it's not a bad number, but they still would have left a huge number of people stranded to freeze to death. However, the number I've just said is actually a lot better than the number they really saved, which was about 706 people. Now, the lifeboats were a big mistake in the sense that of the 20 lifeboats, there were 16 that were fixed, right? And then there were 4 of them that were collapsibles, which meant that they were lifeboats, but they weren't fixed, ready to go. They were actually stored on deck, and you had to take them out, fix them, then load them, then lower them into the sea to be able to use them. Which meant that it would take a whole lot more time in case of an emergency, and time that turns out they didn't really have. The Titanic hit the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. and about an hour and 5 minutes later, at 12:45 a.m, the first lifeboat, lifeboat number 7, was finally sent off into the freezing darkness. Lifeboat number 7 is recorded to be the first lifeboat ever sent off in the Titanic and had a capacity of about 65 people. And yet, there were only 21 people in that lifeboat. I don't blame the crew for that, because I feel as though had I been a member of that crew, I'd have been like, well, they told us the ship was unsinkable. Clearly that's a lie. So for all you know, it could be a lie as well. Maybe it's not 65 people, maybe it's 25. So let's be careful. But this is a huge mistake that was made in the sense that already you didn't have enough lifeboats, and now you're filling the lifeboats to not even half their capacity. Of course, thousands of people are going to perish. I mean, in this case it was hundreds, but still. So one by one, the 16 lifeboats that were fixed onto the ship were loaded and sent off. And then you had the 4 collapsibles, who were also, at this point, taken out of their storage to be able to be used as well. And the first collapsible that we recorded to be sent off was collapsible C, which had a capacity of 47 people. It had 41 people in it at the time, and it was sent off at about 1:40 a.m. Then you had collapsible D, which had a capacity of 47 people in it as well. This one was filled up with 46 people and was sent off at about 2:05 a.m. Now, collapsible D is the last lifeboat to be recorded to be sent off from the Titanic. So you may wonder, what happened to collapsible A and B? Well, collapsible A and B were recorded to be sent off at around 2:20 a.m. But the time 2:20 a.m. is also the time where the Titanic was recorded to have pretty much completely disappeared from the surface of the water. Which meant that technically those 2 lifeboats weren't sent off, they kind of just floated away as the ship sank. You had collapsible A, which again had a capacity for 47 people, however there were only 16 people that made it into that lifeboat. And the collapsible A kind of floated off into the darkness whilst the Titanic pretty much sank underneath the water. Now, the most tragic story is actually collapsible B, and I believe that it's a scene that you can see in James Cameron's 1997 film, but what happened with collapsible B is that as they tried to get it off of its storage on the deck, it actually fell upside down, and because of the pressure of the water coming in, the Titanic nearly being completely sunk, and also just the general panic of everyone on the ship, they never managed to put collapsible B back the right way around, which meant that collapsible B is sort of the last lifeboat to be recorded to have left the ship with collapsible A, but this one floated off upside down with about 30 men clinging to it. And that's the most tragic part about it, because those men, most of them perished. Because it floated upside down, the 30 men that were clinging onto it, at one point their arms gave out, or the tiredness gave out, or even worse, they died because of the freezing cold. And so most of the men that tried to cling onto this lifeboat for dear life ended up not making it. Now I want to talk about 4 stories that supposedly predicted the tragedy, and then I want to mention a 5th story that happened 23 years later that just proves that history always repeats itself. The first story I want to talk about is a story I like to call An Author Predicts Death. For this, we go back to the year 1892, the year where William T. Stead, an author, wants to publish his book. His book is called From the Old World to the New. And in this book, he talks about a ship that hits an iceberg in the Atlantic and sinks. And then he mentions that the survivors of that ship are saved by another ship. And the captain of the saviour ship is a man called E.J. Smith. Now, 20 years later, the author who wrote this book finds himself as a passenger on the Titanic. And the captain of the Titanic was a man called Edward John Smith, E.J. Smith. Unfortunately, like many others in the Titanic, the author, William Teasdale, did not make it out alive. Neither did Edward John Smith, by the way. Now I want to mention the second story, which I like to call We Should Have Known. And this takes us back to the 20th of September 1911. The Titanic had a sister ship called the RMS Olympic. The RMS Olympic is Titanic's sister ship in the sense that they are almost identical, apart from the fact that the Titanic is just a little bit bigger generally. The RMS Olympic and the RMS Titanic are completely identical. But on that day, the 20th of September 1911, the RMS Olympic got into a collision with a warship called the HMS Hawke. Everything was fine, the collision wasn't fatal. However, the captain of the RMS Olympic was found to be at fault. And the captain of the RMS Olympic was none other than Edward John Smith, who then a few months later went on to captain the Titanic. Now I want to move on to the third story, which I like to call A Guide to Foreshadowing. Now this takes us back to the year 1898, where there's a guy called Morgan Robertson who decides to write a story. Now his book is actually very, very similar to the 1892 story of the previous author I mentioned. However, there are 3 details in his story that make his novel even closer to the story of the Titanic. So the story is about a ship that crosses the Atlantic, hits an iceberg and sinks, right? Very similar to the previous story. But the first detail is that this ship tried to cross the Atlantic at record speed and time, exactly like the Titanic. And that when it sank, in his story, the ship loses most of its passengers and crew. There's a huge loss of life, just like in the Titanic. And the third detail of his story, which is kind of like the glue that gets this whole story together, is the title of the story. Because Morgan Robertson decided to write this novel and name it Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. Very close to the Titanic. The fourth story that apparently predicted the tragedy is the story of a little Scottish girl. Now this Scottish girl was called Jessie. On the night of the 14th to the 15th of April 1912, the night the Titanic sank, she was laying on her deathbed and she was very sick. She was so sick that she was actually delirious. And at one point she was so delirious that she saw a vision. And in that vision she saw a ship sinking in the Atlantic, many people drowning, and a man named Wally playing the fiddle. Now the fiddle is a colloquial term for the violin, and that's a very important detail for the rest of that story. Unfortunately that night that poor girl passed away, and within a few hours of her death, the Titanic hit an iceberg, sank, many people drowned, and the band famously played until the end. On any other night, the band would have been playing for the first class passengers whilst they were having their dinner. But when the ship sank, they actually stayed on the deck until humanely possible and played their songs until the very end. This meant that every single one of them went down in the ship. None of them survived. They all perished, including the member who played the violin, who was a man who was 33 years old, and he was called Wallace Hartley. Nickname, Wally. Now these are just some of the hundreds of stories or conspiracy theories that you can have about the Titanic. If you Google it, you can literally find thousands of people who tell stories, who invent things. Some of them are true, some of them are not true. And I want to talk about one story that happened in 1935, April 1935, so 23 years later, and there's a ship called the Titanic. And this ship is carrying coal from Newcastle all the way to Canada. And this ship crosses the Atlantic. And the crazy thing about this ship is the fact that it nearly hits an iceberg at the exact same spot that the Titanic hit an iceberg 23 years earlier. And the only reason why it didn't hit that iceberg is because a crew member called William Reeves had a premonition that there was danger, shouted that there was danger, and asked for the ship to be stopped. So you may think, I mean, this is crazy. Not only was it the exact same spot, but also this guy had a premonition. But there's a third detail that makes this story even crazier in my mind. The crew member, who was named William Reeves, that man was 23 years old. He was born on the 15th of April 1912, the exact date the Titanic sank. I feel like this is a good conclusion for what I wanted to say, because the question I asked at the beginning of the video was, why do we remember the Titanic over everything else? And I feel as though in popular culture, the reason why we remember the Titanic is because of James Cameron's film, you know. But more generally, it's because of the tragedy of it. The Titanic represented everything people wanted. It represented luxury, comfort, safety, hope. It was a way for people to get back home or to go to America in hope of a new life. But it was also a technical revolution. It revolutionized the way we did travel at the time, because air travel still wasn't really a thing. So on the one hand, the Titanic was all these positive, hopeful things. And yet, throughout history and throughout the Titanic itself, there were clear warning signs that pointed to its demise. There were big red flags that somehow everyone chose to ignore, or people just didn't see, that pointed to the doom of the Titanic. And pointed to it being doomed since forever, apparently. And that's why we remember the Titanic, because of the cruel irony of the story. The fact that the ship that was deemed unsinkable ultimately sank. I will link my sources down below so you know that I haven't made all this up. I'll also link some more content if you're interested in watching some things, or reading or visiting some stuff if you're interested in this story. And I hope you've enjoyed. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you very soon.